We have been going through Romans. If you are visiting with us for the first time, we've been going through Romans for a better part of a year now. And we crested into 13 this week. But last week and the week before that, we broke for a Christmas hiatus. So what I want to do is kind of give us a little bit of run-up for this. And if you haven't been in Romans, you'll know where we're going. Chapters 1 through 11 are the gospel. Chapters 1 through 11 in the book of Romans tell us who you were before you were saved, how it is you became to be saved, what you are now after you're saved, and then where you fit in history as far as it goes with Jews and Gentiles and what is God's plan for his old covenant people. So we saw all of that in chapters 1 through 11. And then a few weeks ago, we broke into chapter 12. And chapter 12 begins the end section of the book of Romans, and it's all practical. It's how do we apply the gospel? The gospel is given to us in clarity and extensiveness in Romans 1 through 11, and then 12 through 16 is this is how the gospel is applied in a Christian's life. This is how you behave as one saved by the gospel. And the first relationship that the Apostle Paul, who wrote Romans, dealt with was the relationship of the Christian to God. Remember Romans 12, 1 and 2? How do we relate to God? We are living in holy sacrifices who are having our minds renewed daily by the word of God. That's how we relate to God. And then Romans 12, 3 through 14, we saw how we relate to each other. How do we relate to other Christians in the body of Christ? We're all individual members, individual body parts with different functions, but all essential to God's purpose. How do we relate to one another? How do we deal with one another? How do we love one another? We saw that 12, 3 through 14. And then 15 through the end of the chapter, through 21, we saw how we're to relate to those who are not saved, to those who would maybe even call themselves our enemies. We saw that we never take our own revenge. We saw that we do not return evil for evil, and we aren't overcome with evil, but instead we overcome evil done against us with good. That's what we saw, how we relate with those individual relationships to God, to Christians, to non-Christians. So it makes sense that chapter 13 will begin with a relationship that every human being on the face of the planet has to be a part of, which is that of the government. How do we as the church relate to the government? Every Christian everywhere and every time has had some form of government, some form of authority over them, and we need to understand how to relate to it. Now, the Bible has two primary realms in which it's going to deal with that this morning in Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. The realm of man and the realm of God. So the realm of man begins like this. You may have gotten to the end of chapter 12 in Romans, and you may have been thinking, it seems like what we're supposed to do is just let evil run rampant all over the place. We're told to never avenge ourselves. It's always wrong for me to take personal revenge. Does that then mean that God has no plan whatsoever for dealing with evil in the human realm? It does not mean that. God does have a plan for that. He does have an institution for that. That institution is the government. That they are to be dealing with evil, that they are to be addressing evil. And the first time government appears in your Bible is in Genesis 9, verse 6. When God tells Noah this, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. God has given us, humanity, three institutions, three major institutions, the family and marriage, the church, and the government. All given by God, all instructed to us by God. And when they're all functioning properly, all of them deal with the restraining of evil. Where does evil first come about in the existence of human beings? In a kid in the house, right? That's where it all comes out. So you have to restrain evil there first. So think about it like this. You have an underage kid who gets caught for drinking. Parents are responsible. You're going to deal with that. What are you doing? You can't do this. Parents come in and address that evil. That kid grows up and becomes older and gets involved in the church, still can't get rid of this drinking problem that they have, still can't keep doing that. So eventually, if they become an unrepentant alcoholic, then the church has to deal with that evil. The church has to address that sin. But when it gets out of the hands of the family and out of the hands of the church is when that guy gets in a car, crosses the double yellow line, and kills somebody. Now the church can't help you, and now your family can't help you. The government comes in to address evil in that way. God has given us three institutions for the restraint of evil. That's the human realm. But in the realm of God, this is what we're going to see in Romans 13, 1 through 7. In our mortal existence here on earth, we're always dealing with the tension of God's sovereignty, man's responsibility. I know God's in control of all of these things, but I also know that I'm making real decisions, and I'm actually accountable for the things that I do or don't do in accordance with or in violation of God's word. So where does that tension then come in with the government? Well, we live in a unique period in world history in that we have never known anything but electing and choosing our own leaders. And that our leaders can only serve for a certain amount of time, and then we get to pick new ones. We get to try again. We're very unique in human history in regards to that we get to choose our leaders. But what we need to know in regards to government in the realm of God is that God is always the one choosing. God is always the deciding vote in everything that's ever happened in our government of all time. He's sovereign over every seat in every government of all time. Daniel describes this. Daniel 4, 34b through 35 says that God's dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" God's sovereign over every human being and every angelic being. But he told this to Pharaoh. He told this to Pharaoh in Exodus 9, verse 16. He said, "But for this purpose I raised you up. You did not ascend to power on your own. You did not lobby and get this chair on your own. I raised you up so that you would know my power and my name would be proclaimed in all the earth." Scriptures have this all over the place. Daniel 2:21, he, meaning God, changes times and seasons. God removes kings and sets up kings. What Romans 13 is going to confront us with on a pretty blunt level is this: whether or not we actually believe that God is in control of our governments and rulers. That's what we're going to be confronted with primarily in these scriptures. What we're going to see is where governmental authority comes from in verses 1 and 2, the origin of authority. And then in verses 3 and 4, what we're going to see is the purpose of authority, the purpose of governmental authority. What's it supposed to do? And then in verses 5 through 7, we're going to see our response to authority. How are we supposed to respond to governmental authority? So let's read these 7 verses, and then we're going to come back to the first 2. Verse 1, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." So go back to verses 1 and 2, the origin of authority. All ruling authority, all authority that exists, only has authority because God gave it to them. Jesus said this to Pilate in John 19, verse 11. When Pilate's boasting and puffing out his chest about his position, about who he is, Jesus says this: "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." You wouldn't be able to do anything at all to a peasant like me if it wasn't for God giving it to you. All authority is from God. Verse 1 of Romans 13, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God." There's no other way around that. All authority is from God, and we are to be subject, verse 1 says. Now that "be subject" in the original languages is a word that's commonly used in connotation with soldiers being subject to their superior officers. You have no option. It's obey or be court-martialed. That's what being subject means, and they're supposed to be. All Christians are to be subject to their government. Why? Because if any authority exists in your life, God has put it there. That's the reason that God gives. In Romans 13, verse 1. God has delegated a portion of his authority to governments. Therefore, to disobey them is to disobey God, according to the Scriptures. Only God has true and final authority. Therefore, only he can give authority to anybody else. When older sister is bossing other siblings around, she has no authority, right? Nobody, I don't have to listen to you. You're my big sister. I don't have to do what you say. I have to clean my room. I don't have to go over there. But what happens when mom and dad leave and big sister is the babysitter? Now they do have to listen to big sister because they carry the weight of mom. And the wrath of mom will come down on them if they don't obey big sister while she's babysitting. The same is true of the government, that God has given that authority to them. They're nothing in and of themselves, but God has given it to them. God has delegated authority to governments of mankind. Therefore, to disobey them is to disobey God. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking in that, what if the government tells me to disobey God? What if the government tells me to do something wrong? We'll get there, but we're not there yet. We're going to let the Bible just say what it plainly says before we answer any exceptions. The government is not God, but the government does, according to Romans 13, represent God. That the dollar bill in your hand is not actually a dollar's worth of gold or whatever backs up our money now, but it represents that much gold. So it does carry the authority of that much gold. That's what Paul's communicating here, that every government in the history of the world has been instituted by God. That's what Romans 13:1 says, plain as day. Do you believe it? That's what you have to ask yourself. Do I believe the plain readings of the Scriptures? If they exist, then God instituted them. There's no other way around that. Therefore, verse 2, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Do you believe that? That whoever resists the government is resisting God and will be judged by God. Do you think our founding fathers believed that? During the American Revolution, they obviously didn't. But we can't get around verse 2. It's as plain as day that if you resist the government, you're resisting God and you will be judged for it. Now, this word resist is not the word stasis in Greek, which has to do with revolt, uprising, upheaval, revolution. No, it's a much weaker word. It's the word in Greek, antitasso. And antitasso is along the lines of over against, that your opinion of how things should be is over against how the government's actually doing them. So it's a much tighter thing. So then does this resistance to the government, which God forbids and says he will judge, does that extend to our social media posts about our government? Does that extend to our private conversations about our government? How tightly should we be disciplining ourselves as to how we put ourselves over against or resist our government? I think David is a great example of this in the Old Testament. David in 1 Samuel chapter 18 begins his running from the king. The king Saul is trying to murder him in chapter 18. But by the time chapter 24 comes about, David has a heart attack over his own sin, and it's in a unique way. In chapter 24 of 1 Samuel, David is on the run. He's been running for his life. Saul's already thrown about 3 spears at him, trying to kill him in the palace. David's out with this band of men living in the wilderness off the land, and they're holed up in a cave in a place called En-Gedi. Now, when they're in the cave, David and his men are way in the back. Saul and his massive army of thousands of men, they come through. The king Saul goes up into the cave by himself to go to the restroom. And this is what David's men say to him, because Saul's completely unaware that the enemy is in the cave. In verse 4 of 1 Samuel 24, and the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. They say, David, this is when God said, kill him. But footnote, God never said that to David. That just sounds like good American Revolution right there. This is God's will. Kill him. So David, what does he do in verse 4? Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He goes and just cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. how does he respond to his own action? Verse 5, and afterward David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord. Lowercase l, meaning Saul. He's the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. Now I want to ask you to think about this. Would you have told David to kill Saul? David, he is a wicked ruler. He doesn't love God. He hates the Bible. He's not obeying anything moral whatsoever. He's an evil ruler. He's got it coming. Go ahead and kill him. You're already anointed to be the next king. You would be godly. You would be good. The ends justify the means, David. It may be messy, but you need to do it now. Would you be along those lines, or would you have wept with David? David is weeping over his sin. His heart is struck, it says, and he didn't even kill him. Would you weep with David, or would you be like, come on, David. Don't be so hard on yourself. Not that big of a deal. You just cut his robe. You didn't even kill him. And if you did kill him, you would have been justified because he's so evil, because he's so bad. He's harming the people. You're the only godly leader in the country, and you're running for your life. So don't be so hard on yourself. No, David believed something that we must all come to believe. When you resist and you rise up against governmental authority, this is what you are telling God. God, you are not handling human affairs good enough. I am a better judge of how that should go. Therefore, I'm going to enforce my will on this scenario. God, I make better decisions in appointing governmental leaders than you do. You've blown this one. I'm going to fix your mistake. It's defying God. David repented because he knew that was a sin, and he knew that he was under the judgment of God for that sin. Exactly what Paul wrote in Romans 13:2. David understood the origin of all governmental authority, and it's God's to raise up and it's God's to put down, not his. So that's the origin of authority. Then what is the role? What is the purpose of governmental authority? Well, that's what Paul goes into next in verses 3 and 4. That God does have a primary purpose for governments. Verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. The primary purpose of governments is not just to exist for their own sake, that they don't just get to do whatever they want to do. God has a design for them, and his primary design for them is not highways and roads and parks and recreation. Their primary purpose is the restraint of evil. That's what they're there for. They're there to restrain evil. Do you know why everybody hates cops sitting on the highway? Because you're breaking the law. You're either speeding, your tags are out, or you have contraband in your car. If you weren't speeding, and if your car was up to date, according to the law, and you didn't have anything illegal in your car, you wouldn't have any problem with a black and white cruiser on the shoulder of the highway. But if you're breaking the law, then you have cause for terror. You have cause for fear. That's the only reason why. God's role for government is to punish evil, not pester those who are doing good. Law-abiding citizens should always have amicable relationships with the government. The church submits to the government in the area of law and order and experiences a relatively peaceful existence. And we know that has an asterisk, and we're going to get there later. But that's what verse 3 says. And in verse 4, he says he is God's servant. He, meaning governmental official, is God's servant for your good. He's God's servant. If you have a New American Standard or a King James, that says minister. It's the Greek word diakonos, where we get the word deacon from. That he is God's servant, meaning he is under God's authority. He is subordinate to God, and God does what he wants. He's under his control. Proverbs 21:1 tells us, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. God's hand is sovereignly guiding every government in the world, and he has done so for all time. However, what is true of us, if we're obeying the law, that's what the role of government is. But what does it say in verse 4? But if you do wrong, be afraid. That's what it says. Be afraid. for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. If you partake in wrongdoing, Paul says you should be afraid of the government because he bears a sword. In God's divine providence, he gave the government a sword, and it's not made of plastic. It is a metal sword. And a sword in the New Testament is always associated with death. It's not a ceremonial sword. It is for carrying out justice, because real evil needs a real sword to address it. So what Paul's saying here is the answer to the question you might have had at the end of Romans 12. If I'm never to avenge myself, if I'm never to take my own revenge, when people are evil against me, I come back to them with good. Personally, that's what I'm supposed to do. Well, then what do we do with the problem of evil that exists in our world? Well, God says, I have a plan for that government is supposed to put down evildoers. Government does take vengeance. It says he is an avenger who carries out God's wrath. That's why we have biblical support for institutions of law enforcement, police departments, militaries, judges. And those judges have real gavels that hand down real sentences. And those police officers have real guns with real bullets, because the sword is made of metal and not of plastic. That real evil needs to be really addressed in the human realm, that God does have a plan for that. And that is to be through the means of lawful government. And if we make the sword into plastic, if we take the lead out of the guns and we take the gavel out of the hand, then what we're saying is, God, we are more merciful than you. We understand grace on a level that you just don't get. We're going to give grace where God says give sword. We can't do that. This is what the purpose of the government is. We can't tell God you don't understand grace correctly. A lot of us do that in misguided ways when we hear Jesus' words like turn the other cheek. That happened to me one time. I had a bike stolen out of my garage, and I was restoring it to a 1980s BMX. I had put a lot of money into it, and it was looking really cool. I was calling it the Fresh Prince. It was an awesome bike. And a guy stole it out of my garage and left his junky bike there in place of it. Just one for one traded it. I was so bummed. Rest in peace to that bike. So I called the police, and the policeman came, and he took my statement and all this stuff, and he said, do you want to press charges if we catch the guy? And I said, oh, no, I don't want to press charges. He goes, really, you sure? I was like, yeah, no, I don't want to do that. Thinking that I'm just high and mighty and merciful, and I'm just so kind. And then I happened to have a friend who was at my church at that time who was a College Station Police Department officer. And I told him about it, and I said, yeah, but I didn't press charges. He goes, what, man, why'd you do that? You got to press charges on that. I'm like, well, turn the other cheek. And, what? He goes, no, this is the role of restraining evil. Why would that kid ever get off the track he's on if he never gets punished for anything that he ever does? It's God's kindness to do that, to have there be consequences for sin. And what's going to keep him from doing a worse crime later on? There need to be consequences on the level of government enforcement. Not me personally taking my revenge and going and finding that guy and beating him up and taking it back, but allowing the police to do what God sanctioned them to do. Now, that does just mean we have to address that the Bible is for the death penalty and the existence of militaries. It can't mean anything else. When Adam and Eve sinned and they were kicked out of the garden, an angel sentinel was placed in front of it. And what was in that sentinel angel's hands? A sword that was on fire. Was that just for ceremony? What happened if Adam and Eve had tried to come back in the garden in violation and defiance of God? Would he have just waved at Adam, trying to scare him to get him to go away? Or was that a real sword for real justice? We have to say that's what Genesis 9 verse 6 is all about. That whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Why would God tell Noah that? Noah gets off the ark with his family in Genesis 9, and one of the first things he tells them is, hey, you need to execute somebody who kills another person. Why would he say that? What was the world like before the flood? The world that God destroyed was completely lawless. It was full of sin. Everybody did what was exceedingly evil all the time. And God said, when he reboots humanity in Genesis 9, I'm delegating to you from my hands the ability to govern yourselves. the ability to restrain evil physically in the human realm. And why is that? In Genesis 9, verse 6, why is it life for life? What does it say? For God made man in his own image. The death penalty for murder in God's eyes is because murdering a human being is blaspheming God in effigy. God takes it as a personal attack because his people that he created are image bearers, whether they are in the womb or out of the womb. They are image bearers of God, and God takes it as a personal attack on his character and identity to kill a human being. That's why he lays it out so strongly, that there's divine consequences for evil, that this institution, Genesis 9, is long before any Mosaic law, so it's a creation ordinance. And if anything is present in creation ordinance before the law, then it extends through the period of the law and into the New Testament world in which we live now. And so therefore, God is saying, when you commit murder, when you slander and blaspheme God in his effigy, in his representations, then you have forfeited all right to your own life. And that's why God gives the government a real sword. He delegated the task of avenging evil to a specific entity in human society, to the government. There's no room for vigilantism. It is for the government to do. And what is our response to be to this government? If that's their purpose, what's our response? In verse 5, this is our response. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Because it's true, this is what Paul's saying in verse 5, because it's true that every single governmental employee, official, office holder, delegate, king has been appointed by God, placed there by God, because that's true, and because their role is to punish those who do evil, then we must submit to and obey the government for two reasons. To avoid God's wrath. That's a good thing. It's okay to do the right thing so that punishment doesn't come upon you. But as Christians, our motivation goes further than that. All obedience begins there, but our obedience goes further than that. What does it say in verse 5? But also for the sake of conscience. That's our motivation. That's our deepest motivation. That word there, for the sake of conscience, is all one word. It's sunadesis. And that means the awareness of something, the consciousness of something, or it can refer to the inward faculty of determining right and wrong inside each person. That's for the sake of your conscience. And where we read in 1 Peter 2, that parallel section about the government, 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. Well, if you go to verse 19 in 1 Peter 2, the same word, sunadesis, is there, but it's translated as being mindful of God. And I think that's a helpful way for us to understand what is this for the sake of conscience. It's us being mindful of God. That's why we obey the government, because we are mindful of God. Our subjection to the government has nothing to do with its worthiness, but it has everything to do with God's worthiness. See, what we've done in the church is we've imbibed too much of the wisdom of the world. And the wisdom of the world says, I'm only going to respect governments or any authority when they are respectable. If they are not respectable, then I do not respect them. When has the Bible ever taught that? On any level of any kind of authority. Wives, submit to your husbands only when they've earned it. Only when they've deserved it. When they're respectable. Children, obey your parents as long as they are walking in step with the Spirit. No, it doesn't say that at all. We are not allowed to reject authority because it doesn't do what we want it to do. That we are to be submissive to it to avoid God's wrath and for the sake of our conscience. If God is sovereign over all authority in our lives, which he is, 1 Peter 2:13, for the Lord's sake, submit yourselves to every human institution. If he's sovereign over them all, then we submit to it out of reverence for him, for the sake of our conscience. One commentator, William Hendrickson, he said it like this. He said, this matter of conscience must not be passed over lightly. It should be borne in mind that a Christian's enlightened conscience is his sense of obligation to God. If we as the church are going to submit ourselves to the governing authorities, it will always be primarily because of our mindfulness of God. It will never be because the government is in perfect lockstep with the Word of God. What government in the history of the world has ever fully obeyed the law of God? Israel didn't even do that. So we can't wait around for a government that's perfectly in step in every possible way with everything in the scriptures to obey it. That's not what we're commanded to do. It's as if we think we're the first society that's ever had to deal with a government that makes rules that we don't like or that are straight up sinful. That we're the first country, the U.S. in 1973, when abortion's made legal across all 50 states, that we're the first country to ever deal with something like that, the killing of babies. We do realize the Roman Empire was way worse. In the Roman Empire, everybody wanted a son, and you had no way to know the gender of your baby before it was born. And if it was born a girl, what you did under the legal jurisdiction of Roman law, you took your baby girl and you just left her on the curb outside to die of exposure. That's what you would do. Perfectly legal to do that. And what men would do who ran brothels is they would just go around town in a wagon and pick up those little baby girls and raise them to be prostitutes in a brothel. So what the church did, when the church comes about in the Roman Empire, they don't throw a fit and raise Cain and protest. They just wake up earlier than the pimps and go pick up the baby girls first and raise them as their own. So we're not the first government or first country to ever deal with a government that does things that are sinful or wrong. And realize the Roman Empire is the government that Paul and Peter are writing to people to obey. Be subject to Rome, is what they're saying. Be subject to wicked emperors, is what they're saying. That's what they're telling them to do. The only reason that they would do it is because they were mindful of God, not because the government was worthy in and of itself. For because of this, verse 6, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God according to this very thing. This is why we pay taxes. Not because we think the government uses tax money well. We know it doesn't. That's not why we pay taxes. It's because we trust God and His Word and that He is the ultimate authority. That's why we do that. And out of obedience to Him. You don't get to choose how the government uses your money. You pay it in obedience because you believe that God is in control. I think part of the reason why we pay taxes and why we're commanded plain as day in the scriptures to pay taxes is just another way to prove to us that we are not in control of every aspect of our lives like we think we are. And that includes your money. God is in control of all of those things. That we pay taxes because you are not sovereign. God is. You don't get to demand and choose everything the way it goes in your life. God does that because He's sovereign. We have to deal with this on these levels. The Roman government was overbearingly oppressive when it came to taxes. Putting people into poverty over it, and they don't care. And Paul tells them, pay your taxes. But it's going to make me homeless. Pay your taxes. That's what he says. Let's take special notice of who he calls them. Also in verse 6, for because of this you also pay taxes. Why? For the authorities are ministers of God. Now we saw earlier they were called servants. That was the Greek word diakonos, where we get the word for deacon in the church. This is not that word. This ministers of God. This is the word liturgos, where we get the word liturgy. This word is used to describe priests and angels in the scriptures. So Paul is calling them true and religious servants of God, that they are underneath the authority of God, and you pay them taxes like you tithe to the church. That's why you do that God is sovereignly in control of all the things. And what this should do, this shouldn't cause us to panic. I'm not in control of all these things. What it should do is it should reassure us. It should cause us to just breathe a breath of fresh air. Thank goodness. God is just telling me He is absolutely 100% in control of the authorities above me. And they are accountable to Him as liturgos, as those who are ministers. They're accountable. You know, Hebrews 13 says in verse 17 that elders, pastors and elders are going to give an account for every single soul in their charge. I'm going to answer for every single person in this church to God, and so are the rest of the elders. As ministers of God, that's what he says we're responsible for in Hebrews 13. And in Romans 13, he says the same is true of all government officials. Like God said, hey, I entrusted you, pastors and elders, the responsibility of this church, and I'm going to hold you accountable for how you discharge that duty. He says the same thing to government officials. I delegated to you all of this authority. I had these people give you their money, and you are going to be held accountable for what you did with it. You are going to be called to account for that. That should let us breathe a breath of fresh air. That this is God's deal, top to bottom. Verse 7, pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. It's funny that Paul didn't come up with this at all. This is out of the mouth of Jesus. Remember Matthew 22? When Jesus is kind of put to the test about paying taxes or not, this is what he says. He says, just bring me a coin. They bring him a coin. He says, whose face is on it? They say Caesar's. And he says, well, then give it to Caesar. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So Jesus just says, pay taxes, almost dismissively, as if the kingdom of God, we have much bigger fish to fry than bickering over what money goes where and who gets it. We have a lot more important things to do than that. And then in Matthew 17, Jesus himself pays the temple tax. Have you ever thought about this? Think about it if you haven't. Jesus, there's no recorded in all four Gospels, there's no record of Jesus smiling or laughing, but there is a record of Jesus paying taxes. What should that say to us? That maybe life's not all about having happiness and joy and a perfect existence, and it's about obeying God, being obedient to the Word of God. And did you notice at the end of verse 7, it says, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed, that we owe respect and honor to every government official above us, every civil authority above us. Can you say that you have respected and honored every United States president that has ever been in office? Of course you can. If you disagree with the guy, you say he's an idiot, you say he's a loser, you slander him online, and then you blast him in public. That's what we do. I don't like him, he's a buffoon, so I don't respect him and I don't honor him. Well, that's your direct violation of verse 7. There's no other way around that. Why? Even if the guy does institute something truly evil, like a dictator in China would be, do I still owe him respect and honor? Yes, because God says so. And here's why everybody goes nuts watching their 24-hour cable news networks, and they're panicking and they're freaking out, causing them to slander, disrespect, and dishonor all government officials. And here's the underlying reason, the only underlying reason. It's because you believe that human beings are in charge of your country. Whereas the Bible teaches that God is in charge of your country. And therefore you have no room for anxiety, no room for slander, no room for disrespect and dishonor in any way. We must believe that God is sovereign over our country. Otherwise we can't obey this. How did men and women in the Old Testament under truly pagan, godless, heathen leaders, how did they respond to them? How does Esther treat the king who yanked her out of her house and just threw her in his harem like a broodmare? How does she treat the king? What does she say over and over when she talks to the king? Reverential. She says, if it please the king, O king, if it please you, could we do this or that? Humble, respectful, honoring. How does Nehemiah, who's been basically enslaved, made a eunuch under this Persian king, how does he treat that king? He says, let the king live forever before he talks to him. How does Daniel deal with the king that he's over, who has oppressed them and yanked all of him and his family and friends out of their land and made them servants, basically? When he gets a prophecy from God that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be punished, this is what Daniel says. He says, oh, that this were for the king's enemies and not for the king. Daniel says, I wish this was happening to your enemies and not to you, oh wicked, evil king. Respect and honor. That's how he handles it. But what do? We have to address it. What do we do when government goes bad? Government does go bad. Government does not do its purpose in verses 3 and 4 all the time, maybe even most of the time. So what do? How do we respond to that? The Bible is clear. When the government requires us to do something that God forbids, or forbids us from doing something that God requires, then we must disobey. Then we say, like Peter in Acts 5:29, that we will obey God and not men on this issue. That's what we do. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are perhaps the best example of this in all of Scripture. So those 4 men, they get yanked out of their homeland, brought into Babylon, and then they're just thrown into the king's service. You're in this stable of young men, and you're going to be used for whatever the king wants you to be used for. First thing you have to do is you have to start eating this food. And all of that food was in violation of the Old Testament covenant. Would all defile them under the Mosaic law. And they don't go, no, I have a right to free religion. You can't make me do this. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to have a sit-in, and I'm going to picket, and I'm going to blast out everybody on email and tell them how wicked you are. No, this is what Daniel says. Daniel 1:8, it says, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him to not defile himself. He doesn't go, you can't make me defile myself. I have inalienable rights. He says, hey, I want to ask you something. Would you allow us to not defile ourselves according to our faith in the one true God of the Bible? That's how he responds. That's in Daniel 1. In Daniel 3, things get worse. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're minding their own business, being faithful, good employees of the government. The king says, I'm building a giant statue of myself. Everybody has to pray to it when I blow the horn. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just simply don't bow down. That's all they do. They don't bow down. They get told on. They get brought before the king. And the king says, if you don't do this, if you don't obey me, I'm going to throw you into a bonfire so hot that it'll kill you if you just get close. What do they say? Verse 18 in chapter 3 in Daniel, they say, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you set up. All they say is, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They don't demand their rights of free speech. They don't say, we have freedom of religion. They don't squawk back about their First Amendment rights. They just say, we're not going to do this. And if you throw us in the fire, that's fine. God can save us, but he might not. And even if he doesn't, we still can't bow down. That's just kind of where we are with the situation. That's where they left it. And God, in his kindness, saved them. And then Daniel 6, this one's the most ludicrous, I think. Daniel 6, we've heard the story, Daniel and the lion's den, but have you ever sat and thought about that these other satraps, they come to King Darius and they say, let's make a law. This would be a fun thing to do. For just 30 days, everybody prays to you. What trivial, silly law is that? For 30 days? But they do, and the king signs it. That sounds good to me. He signs it into law. Daniel is a government employee at the time, working for the king. And when he hears of this new law, you know what he does? He takes to social media and he just rips the king apart. And he says, you can't make me do this. You're stepping on my rights. I have freedom of worship. I have freedom of religion. I have freedom to speak my mind. I can do whatever I want. He didn't say that. This is what he does. He goes to the people and riles them up and says, no prayer without representation. We can't be enforced like this. And then he goes to storms the palace and they kill the king. Doesn't do that. This is what he does. Chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel knew the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. He does exactly what he's always done. He just keeps on being faithful. He doesn't say, you can't tell me I can't pray to you. I'm going to go sit in your office with 100 of my friends and we're going to pray to God in your face. He just goes and does what he always did, probably knowing that there was a trap set for him. I mean, they find a guy in his closet in a closed door during breakfast, lunch, and dinner praying. That's where they go get him. And he just takes it. Yeah, I did do that, and I will get thrown in the lion's den. That's correct. This day may not be too far from us. And what we need to do is prepare ourselves to respond biblically and not Americanly. So when this day does come, the only time we can disobey our government is if they require us to violate God's word. And when that punishment does come, we take it. Like Daniel, like Shadrach, like Meshach, like Abednego, like Pastor Wang Yi in a Chinese prison right now. Pastor Wang Yi, I've been following his church through World Magazine. It's a Christian news group for the past couple of years. And he has a church, Early Rain Church in Chengdu, China, and he just got arrested on December 9th for the heinous crime of having a church and a Christian school and not hiding it. So he got arrested for that, and he's in jail. And he wrote this letter. And he told everybody to read this letter when he was in jail for longer than 48 hours. I'm going to read you some parts of it, and I want you to hear this brother who is a brother in Christ and is in jail right now, today, right now. And this is his letter. You can find it online and read it, and you should. It says this: on the basis of the teachings of the Bible and the mission of the gospel, I respect the authorities God has established in China, communist China. For God deposes kings and he raises up kings. This is why I submit to the historical and institutional arrangements of God in China. As a pastor of a Christian church, I have my own understandings and views based on the Bible about what righteous order and good government is. At the same time, I am filled with anger and disgust at the persecution of the church by this communist regime, at the wickedness of their depriving people of the freedom of religion and of conscience. But changing social and political institutions is not the mission I have been called to, and it is not the goal for which God has given his people the gospel. For all hideous realities, unrighteous politics, and arbitrary laws manifest the cross of Christ, the only means by which every Chinese person must be saved. They also manifest the fact that true hope and a perfect society will never be found in the transformation of an earthly institution or culture, but only in our sins being freely forgiven by Christ and in the hope of eternal life. He says, I accept the fact that this communist regime has been allowed by God to rule temporarily. As the Lord's servant John Calvin said, wicked rulers are the judgment of God on a wicked people, the goal being to urge God's people to repent and turn again toward him. For this reason, I am joyfully willing to submit myself to their enforcement of the laws as though submitting to the discipline and training of the Lord. He goes on to say that he rejects their perspective that the communist regime's persecution against the church is greatly wicked. But then he says this, but this does not mean that my personal disobedience and the disobedience of the church is in any sense, quote, fighting for rights or political activism in the form of civil disobedience, because I do not have the intention of changing any institutions or laws in China. As a pastor, the only thing I care about is the disruption of man's sinful nature by this faithful disobedience and the testimony it bears for the cross of Christ. I am not interested in changing any political or legal institutions in China. I am not even interested in the question of when communist regimes' policies persecuting the church will change. Regardless of which regime I live under now or in the future, so long as the secular government continues to persecute the church, violating human consciousness that belong to God alone, I will continue my faithful disobedience. For the entire commission of God has given me is to let more Chinese people know through my actions that the hope of humanity and society is only in the redemption of Christ and the supernatural gracious sovereignty of God. If God decides to use this persecution of this communist regime against the church to help more Chinese people to despair of their futures, to lead them through a wilderness of spiritual disillusionment, and through this to make them know Jesus, if through this he continues disciplining and building up his church, then I am joyfully willing to submit to God's plans, for his plans are always benevolent and good. Can we amen that, Pastor? He's in jail right now, looking at 15 years for just preaching at church. This is what we need to be ready to do. We need to be under the belief, rather, that it is far more significant to be used of God to bring one sinner to Christ than it is to temporarily turn the government closer towards biblical morals after spending years and years of trying. Far more significant to be saving souls because we trust in the sovereignty of God over our government. And we trust that he is able and powerful and mighty to bring us safely home. Because our citizenship is not here, it is in heaven. And that's what Romans 13 teaches us. Let's pray.